And we're back continuing to paint our party's warlock, Gonthor, who is a changeling disguised as a half-elf. And the player has had to bow out a couple of sessions, but we're going to have this ready to go when they come back to the table. And you can see from the base, the player's favorite color is purple. We've done the skin, we've done the undershirt, we have gotten the face all done. Now it's time to focus on some clothing. And I definitely want to incorporate the purple. So this mini has 2 layers, and we're going to speed it up because this is a long painting session. But he's got kind of a under tunic, I guess. His robes have like 2 layers to them, so almost a tabard on top. And the first part over the undershirt we're going to paint with a very dark purple, and this is really going to set the shadows in on the mini and really make it really dark looking. And the dark purple, we're going to start with the darkest purple and then highlight up and still keep this very dark, this under layer which goes down to the legs. But we want to make this really dark, and then the tabard on the top will have be a lighter purple. We'll actually use the same tones of purple, but by starting with this really dark purple color, like I said, it's going to really set the mini off and really have the rest of it pop out really well after the fact. And there are a little amount of details on here. There are some like leather bindings or straps on this material that we're not going to get to in this session of the painting this Gonthor monk mini. Even though the player character is not a monk, I thought the sculpt was really well done. This is a Reaper mini, and it'll work really well for a warlock, even though it's meant to be a monk. But I think it works really well for anything not in armor. As a fun fact, this is actually the 3rd time I've painted this sculpt. So definitely one that I enjoy painting, and seems to be pretty popular with people. The other 2 were commissions. This one's just a gift for a player, but pretty popular miniature. It's a newer one from Reaper Minis, and so it's gotten quite a bit of good receiving from tabletop gamers or miniature enthusiasts anyhow. As far as I'm concerned, this is only one of 2 miniatures that I've painted multiples of, so a pretty popular mini in my neck of the woods. And even sped up, you can tell this is taking a little bit of time just getting in all the nooks and crannies. They can be a little daunting, just making sure you get that gray primer covered and good thin even coat. This is right out of the bottle. I know I need it to be pretty opaque, so I have not used any medium to thin it down. Just right out of the bottle onto my wet palette and applying it onto the miniature. And looking for any missed spots. You can tell in the video that almost looks black, but I do guarantee you it is purple. This is a Reaper paint, so very vivid colors. And yeah, while it looks black, it is actually purple. You'll see it stand out a little more as we begin to highlight on the folds. Also doing the staff, this is just a tan color. And a lot of people paint the staves almost like you would a branch with a dark brown. And I'm avoiding that just because quarterstaves themselves get pretty worn. They don't have bark on them, so they're pretty light colored. And that's what I'm hoping to emulate with this. I'm going to do a base coat and then a wash and then highlights over the wash, just to have a little bit of the wood grain that is sculpted in stand out a little bit. But I want this to be pretty light colored. And even though it's a warlock who does not use a quarterstaff, because the mini comes with it, I didn't want to convert it and change it over. We're just going to make sure that they are carrying a quarterstaff. Who knows, maybe I'll gift the player a magical quarterstaff in the game. It's hard to say. But it fits the mini really well for the monk class, and the sculpt on it, as I said, is really well done. So we're going to keep the quarterstaff and allow that purple time to dry so we can start our first highlight. So in the previous videos we've talked a little bit about Gonthor, who is a warlock and a changeling, currently disguised as a half-elf. The player has had to sit out a couple of sessions, so we haven't been able to explore the character a whole lot recently. However, while he's out, I do have some side quests that once the player's back in, he'll get updates on to see what Gonthor was out and about doing while the other party members were continuing on the main quest. So should be interesting when he comes back. The warlock patron has actually had Gonthor up to some no good. So we'll see how that turn of event sits when he rejoins the party. Seeing if he talks about it or if he just kind of sits on it quietly. It'll be interesting to see. With the purple, because this is going to have a lot of purple in this tunic, we put some in the shadows of the sleeves. The tabard is also going to have purple. When we get through this paint session, it is going to look extremely purple. If you do mini paintings and you get to this point where it looks like overwhelming, just relax and continue to push through. All miniatures go through a couple of different ugly stages, as I call them, before you can push through and get them to their final. And really have variances of color, which we will have on this miniature. And those other colors, as we go to lay them in one of the future painting sessions that'll come up, will be contrasting with the purple to have the eye really discern the difference between the two. You don't want to do too close. We wouldn't want to put a whole lot of dark blues or dark reds adjacent to the purple, because then it just becomes, your eye has a hard time discerning the differences in the paints because the miniature is so small. Remember, these are only 28 millimeters high, so we'll have more contrasting colors in some of the baubles as well as some of the other trim. And like I said, with the little straps or laces in the tunic, those will also have a bit of contrasting color, just so your eye can pick them out a little bit easier, and they'll really make that miniature stand out. And similar to the past few that we've done, the basing for Gonthor is going to be done off camera, so you will not see the basing process, just because as I finish painting one, I set it aside and base while I'm painting the next one. But we'll give him a really good base as well. Matros has gone through his basing and is on the table currently, and also excited for the player to receive that mini. Here we're just picking up some of the folds in the cloth and then the higher points, and this is a blend of the medium tone and the base tone, so it's really hard to see. But this blending technique, as we continue to get lighter and lighter, you'll see the folds stand out a little bit more. We just want that so it doesn't have super high contrasting, almost like lines in between the different colors. And give that a moment to paint. Again, using really thin paints, so it's drying pretty well. I've got the dehumidifier in, so that the paint is drying at a decent clip. I'm able to continue painting without having to let it sit for a long time to dry. And that really helps just to be able to get this miniature, these bigger pieces done in a decent time. As I said, we've sped this up. So for this video to be over 35 minutes, this is actually about an hour and 20 minutes of painting time. But one of the things I really like to do, so I don't mind doing it, when I am painting miniatures for my players, it's great practice for when I do commissions or competitions. So never mind doing miniatures for my players. Gonthor for the Warlock, it's going to be interesting to see what type of events he will continue to pursue as a character once he realizes kind of how his patron is using him to impact the material plane. See if he stays on that path or looks at breaking his pact. It's going to be interesting. The kind of parts and pieces of his pact are being gone through kind of off the table separately, so it'll be interesting when the player returns to see the impacts that his character has had and what that leads to for interaction for the party as well. So here you can start to see a little bit of the highlights coming up. Some of that is just the sheen from the wet paint in the light, but it does show the color a little bit better as we continue to highlight brighter and brighter and get the sleeves and the sides of that tunic. I guess we'll just call it a tunic since the undershirt goes under the tunic and the tabard goes on top. And that cowl piece, that's where we're going to add in a lot of contrast color to the purple. So that is why I am not going to be painting it in this session. I'm going to save that for the next session with the laces that go on the tunic. Again, picking out two different areas so that as I'm painting, one can dry and I can paint another one, just to make the most of my time at the painting table. And you can see I've got a different mat here as well. I've changed up my painting station a little bit just to be a little more user-friendly. Here I'm doing the brown wash on top of that staff. That's going to settle into the nooks and crannies and kind of give some of the sculpted in details and also sit nice against those hand wraps to where it'll look like the areas that get handled the most are going to be the lighter color. And next, light tone with the purple. This should be getting closer and closer to the medium tone. And the medium tone is actually what we'll use for our darkest tone on the tabard, so that the tone of the purples will remain the same for a little bit of cohesiveness, because Gonthor does not want to look like a homeless person. He's going to have matching clothes that sit well together. So the tones will be the same for the purples that we'll use on this miniature for the fabric. And prior to the player having to dip out for a few sessions, the character of Gonthor was kind of one of the, I hate to say leaders of the group because nobody really wants to lead the party, but one of the forefronts for sure. He was always ready to kind of jump in and get things going once a course of action was decided. So a pretty strong character for kind of steering and keeping things progressing for the party. Whenever they needed to get something done, he was, okay, let's do it. Let's get it done. And Gonthor is pretty determined in that aspect. I think one of the most interesting things, in my opinion, with Gonthor as a character in the campaign is the player, while he chose the Fiendish Pact, he left all the details up to me. So Gonthor as a character has no idea who his patron is, and kind of therefore doesn't know what his patron is kind of after, why he would make the pact. So it's pretty interesting as a DM to be able to have those kind of up my sleeve to unveil before the character and the player at the same time. It's a really cool dynamic that I haven't had the chance yet to really play with as a DM. Usually the player has a good idea of who they want as a patron and how they kind of see themselves making those bargains and what their pact consists of, and while they always leave it up to the GM, this was the first time I really got to do kind of behind the scenes thinking on how to integrate that Fiendish Pact and what that fiend would be after, why they would grant those powers to their basically their contracted servant on the material plane. So it's really kind of fun from that DM perspective to have more behind the scenes notes and that kind of broad spectrum of how I see things playing out from that fiendish point of view. And something I worked into the campaign as well, which we are going to run from, it's designed 5th level to 10th level in my homebrew realm. So should be pretty interesting. You can see here where the purples are starting to stand out a little bit more on the camera. It doesn't look just black. You're able to see some of the folds and shape that are sculpted into this mini on the sleeves, as well as some along the hips and side. So really kind of interesting to utilize these highlights to call attention to that. And still not as bright as it will get. It will have further highlights, but you can definitely tell the shapes that are sculpted into the miniature, even with such a dark base. One of the secrets I learned a long time ago about painting miniatures is your shadows, you really want them to be very, very dark. And that's a hard thing to do. It's a super hard thing when you're painting to really go very dark on the shadows, because when you see these on the table, which is where the majority of the miniatures that I paint are for tabletop use, not just display or show, when you paint really dark, a lot of times game areas, wherever you're playing, doesn't have super bright light. So it's scary in that some of the things may not show. But by going with a super dark tones, it really augments the sculpt itself. Those shadows really are shaded on the game table. And especially for something like this, and where we did Jaw with the really dark armor, those kind of darker character classes or personalities, I like to really show through the miniature. This is not a cleric of Pelor. This is a warlock who has made a pact with a fiend. So I want really, really dark tones on this miniature. And when you put this miniature up next to, say, Dell, that we painted in earlier videos, there's going to be a stark contrast between the two. One is very light and, worshipping a fire god, emulating those bright colors with a rainbow pattern for the player's fantastic personality. This character is got a dark warlock background, and I want it to really show in the paint job. When you see the two next to each other, you should be able to say, well, that Dell looks like a very nice, bright, cheerful, Lathander worshipping cleric. This Gonthor, he's kind of shady. So I want that emulated on the table, and that's why I chose to go with this real dark purples for the colors. Of course, if the player had chosen their favorite color to be blue or green, I would do the same thing and start out with almost black tones. Just the shading is what it's all about, the darkest tones, and then highlighting up. That's really what I'm going for with this paint job. It's kind of interesting. I believe the player for Gonthor was actually the first person to put in for a seat at this campaign table, and I had to start a new campaign, moving to a new area. I was hoping to really be able to build up a group over a couple of months, like my last couple of campaigns. But this one, there were so many people looking for games, it filled up very fast. And I believe, if I'm not mistaken, the player for Gonthor was actually the first one that I confirmed had a seat in the table. Because I kind of try to be a little picky about who I DM for, I want players who have good creativity, can get along really well with each other around the table. They're not going to be rules lawyers. That's something I don't like at my tables. But ultimately people who can really get along with each other really well and help craft a story. Because for me, that's the entire goal. I hope that comes through with the miniatures. I want every aspect of the game to tell a story. I want the miniatures to tell a story. I want the players to tell a story. I want the characters to tell a story. Sitting around and playing Dungeons and Dragons or GURPS or Star Frontiers, Star Wars, Battlestar Galactica, whatever games I'm playing, it should be all about the story. Here we go with the lighter tones. This is back to the base tone on the staff. And I'm just using the kind of side of my brush more than anything, and getting the lighter areas just relightened on the staff. So by using the side of the brush, any of the sculpted details will still retain some of that darker brown shade. And you can see as it gets closer to the wrap, I don't go all the way up to the wrap because I want those areas to be a little darker. And this will just give it kind of a worn look and really allow it to look like a quarterstaff and not just a branch that's covered in bark from a tree. And we'll go through and do the wraps as well. And for the wraps, because we're doing a tan quarterstaff, I'm going to do an off-white, so it'll be a fabric wrapped quarterstaff and not leather wrapped, just for more contrast. The contrast is just definitely needed for these miniatures. You need to be able to tell the different pieces. This is going to stand out from the hand as well as from the quarterstaff itself. So starting with just a linen white, and then same process for this. I'll put a light brown wash on it and then go back through with the linen white and then a couple of touches of just pure white. That'll make it look like almost bandage material. So a linen style wrap. Of course, you could do these in colors and have it be like a wool wrap. If you wanted to go with something like that too, you could definitely justify it. If you want to have a little more color pop off of this, I actually thought about doing it with green, because green is such a good complementary color to go with purple. But because it's a ways away from the purple, I like the kind of linen wrap myself. So there again, it's going to stand out really well from the staff, stand out from the hand, and a little bit from the sleeve. Not a whole lot because they both have a linen white base, but the sleeve has that purple shade where this will have a brown shade. So it'll stand out a little bit. Once that dries, we'll put on the wash. Here we go with the mid-tone on the purple we're putting on the tabard. And this is where it starts getting more and more challenging because you'll see how much of this miniature gets to be purple. And it's kind of a daunting task. I had to remix my paint a little bit there. It sat a little bit long on my wet palette, so it thinned out a little too much. So I had to add a couple more drops to thicken it up. And we don't want it too thick, but we want it to be able to have good opacity as we spread it around. And here the sculpting on these fabric pieces, it's pretty dynamic sculpting. It's got a lot of movement to it. So really have to get a lot of different angles and really pick out some of the details so that you've got good coverage, but you're not over covering anything you've already painted. And that's always a challenge when you get into these dynamic sculpts. But again, this is the same mid-tone we used on the Tunic, but for the Tabard, this is going to be its darkest shade, and then we'll actually lighten up brighter than we did on the Tunic. So it'll have definitely a very different coloration than the Tunic, but I think it'll look really, really nice. Of course, if you're enjoying this video, I know this is a long one, but feel free to pop these mini masteries on while you're sitting and studying or at work. Super relaxing for just watching some miniatures get painted. If you're curious about kind of techniques and just want to give some criticisms, I'm happy to take comments down below. Of course, at the end, we're going to ask you to subscribe. I definitely am looking for getting as many people subscribed to my channel as possible. If you like miniature painting and RPGs and gaming, we try to put out a good quantity of good quality content. So be sure to hit that subscribe button. And again, these purples, the tones are going to be the same, but you can already see a difference just from that base coat and the Tunic. There's a bit of blend, but quite a bit of difference just in the shadowing. Shadowing, not shadding. Shadowing, shading. And like I said, we're going to put the highlights to this much brighter than we did on the Tunic. So the Tabard is going to get quite a bit brighter. And just following, the light is going to be coming from above. That's what I always do with PCs. The light source I envision being directly above them. So looking at where that light would hit folds and creases, any areas of fabric that are kind of flapping up in the wind. And that's one of the biggest differences that you can do when painting a miniature, is really think about where is your light source coming from. You want to make sure that you have consistency throughout the entire miniature. And this one we do a couple of layers of each tone just to get good opacity. You can see that already, that's not even our mid-tone, and it's so much brighter in color than what our Tunic was. So look at the difference in those sleeves versus that Tabard, just the top part. Already quite a bit of difference. Even though it's the same tone, both purples, it definitely looks like two different materials, two different fabrics. And in previous times that I've painted this, I've done 2 different colors on these different fabrics, but again, I thought for the character, just keeping with the purple, which is the player's favorite color, I wanted to see how it came out for one, and I'm very confident that it'll come out really well, especially when we do the accessories. Speaking of which, let's jump back and do the brown wash. This is just a light brown wash onto the linen wraps on the quarterstaff. Just a good hearty amount of brown wash that'll sit in the crevices, really punch up the details on that, on those wraps, and give that time to dry. We'll go back to the tunic, which has now had good time to dry. Continue highlighting up, and again, this paint, when it goes on, it looks a little bit lighter than it gets. So if you see that in your minis as well, don't panic. You can still go 2 shades lighter. I guarantee you. Just make sure to push through. Every mini goes through ugly stages, a few different ones. This one will until we start calling out the details. It's going to look way too dark and way too monotone. That'll change. Watch in the upcoming sessions, you'll see that really change. You can see I do a lot of stippling. That's just to help blend it in a little bit. Almost like a pixelated camouflage. And always being mindful of where is the light going to be hitting these fabric pieces. We don't want to get too deep into the crevices, although I do go quite a ways up towards the pouch, which normally would have deeper shadows, but you'll get those shadows anyhow from the natural lighting. So you don't need to be perfect. It doesn't need to meet every single physics requirement for light and shadow. Because remember, these are 28 millimeters high. You need to do good enough that your eye can differentiate different materials, different colors, and the augment of the sculpt. So pick your battles and paint away. If you're thinking about doing miniature painting, definitely I recommend looking at Reaper Miniature Bones. They are a plastic material. When you get Reaper Bones, all you have to do is give them a good scrubbing, a good wash, glue them to a base, and using Reaper paints, you can paint them right away. You don't need to primer. I do recommend doing a little bit of cleanup, though I'm guilty of not always doing that, but just a little bit of cleanup on any mold lines that may be existing. And they have got fantastic learn to paint kits, as well as brushes, paints, everything you need to be able to get going. Check out reaperminiatures.com. They've got a convention coming up in September. I'll be there. I hope some of my followers will be there as well. Should be a good time. They also do a spring expo. This last spring they did it virtually. Came out great. So there, look at the difference in that tabard to the sleeves. We'll see it closer as well before too long. But what a difference, even though we've got the same tone and really starting with very similar paints. I mean, the midtones are exact, the midtone on the sleeves to the base on the tabard, but highlighting up much brighter. It gives the tabard such a different look. It's almost a more silk-like material, or a thinner linen style or cotton style material, while the tunic with its dark, deep coat looks heavier, maybe woolen, and definitely dyed a darker shade. It definitely has two tones of purple, even though they're the same actual tone. Two shades of purple, just because we highlighted brighter. And here we're going to use our linen white to bring out the details on these wraps again, just to show the separation from where they blend over each other. This will also separate from the wood again, since we put on that wash, that tan wash. Brighten them up, make them look like fabric again. Though now they'll look like a kind of dirtied fabric, a used fabric. Like he has been utilizing this staff for some time, at least walking with it. And it has gotten a little bit of dirt in the wraps, maybe some sweat. And there again, this will really make it stand out from the hand and the wood staff area. So not too shabby. I think Gonthor for this session is going to be done. We've got the tunic done, we've got the tabard done, we've got the staff done. We've got some details to do yet on the stitching for the tunic, but we'll do that when we do the cowl. I think we're going to call this session done. Hope you enjoyed. I hope you enjoyed that video. Here's a link to another video that you may enjoy. Also, make sure you hit that subscribe button to help us grow. If you'd like to support us, make sure you check out the description of the video with some links and leave a comment to let us know where will your adventures take you.